Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Using Alternative Student Growth Measures for Evaluating Teacher Performance. My name is Teresa Duncan. I am facilitating today's meeting. I am also the director of REL Mid-Atlantic. Today's presenter will be Brian Gill. He is the lead author of the report that this webinar is based on, and he is a senior fellow at Mathematica Policy Research. Before we get started, I wanted to go and review a few of the features of our webinar platform with you. And so, as you'll see, this software is modular, and you've got different sections of the screen representing different ways you can interact with us. And so the presenter's photo is up in the upper left-hand corner. That's me. Below that is a box called Questions About Content, so please feel free to type in any reactions, questions, comments that you have as we go along, and we will try to address those questions as we move forward through the webinar. You'll also see down at the bottom left-hand corner, we are closed captioning this, and so that will be available immediately after this webinar as an archived file, so that folks who are hearing impaired are able to also take advantage of this particular webinar. Moving down to the lower middle of your screen are resources to download, and so you'll see that you can download a copy of the PowerPoint slides that we'll be using today, as well as a copy of the report that this webinar is based on. That report is also available on the REL Mid-Atlantic website. Over to the bottom right, we have technical issues, and so if you have any challenges, please do type that in, and then one of our hosts in the background will be able to work with you to try to resolve any technical issues that you might encounter. Hopefully you won't be encountering any. And finally, we have a couple of web links down in the lower right-hand corner. Your feedback is very important to us, and so we hope that you'll take a few minutes at the end of this webinar to fill out the evaluation survey. And there is also, for those of you who would like to submit this experience, this time that you've spent here with us as contact hours for your professional development credits, we are able to provide a certificate of attendance, and so that is an option that you can take if you wish at the end of the evaluation survey. And there's also a link to our forum on our website, and we will, I'll describe that a little bit more later on. So it's a very easy format. I think it's pretty intuitive, and so we hope that you will participate and take advantage of these interactive features. A couple of other items that we will be using today to make this a little bit more interactive, more dynamic, is our polls and open-ended questions. And so you'll see that one type of poll are just, bullets that you can select an option and tell us, endorse that particular option and tell us what's going on from your end. And another type of open-ended poll that we have allows you just to type in your comments and reactions. And so we hope that that will make this a little bit more dynamic and facilitate some discussion amongst our participants. So the agenda today, I've gone through the welcome. I'll tell you a little bit about REL Mid-Atlantic and introduce Brian to you all. And then we'll go through the presentation, have a question and answer period, and then close it up, have some concluding remarks, and adjourn. So this is scheduled to go through 1 p.m. today, and we hope that you'll be able to stay for the whole session. So just a few words about REL Mid-Atlantic. The REL program, the Regional Educational Laboratory Program, is a national program, and it's set up with with a regional focus, and of course this is the Mid-Atlantic. We serve Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia. And the mission of the RELs is really all about technical assistance around data use and data-driven decision-making. And so we pair that technical assistance with the conduct of different types of research studies, and we hope to be able to develop useful, accessible, research-based products that we're able to share with stakeholders in our region as well as nationally. And so we invite you to visit our website, www.relmidatlantic.org, and see what resources there might interest you. And so, before we start, I'd like to ask about who is joining our webinar today. So, Sharon, if you could put that poll up, if you could tell us a little bit about who you are and give us a sense of who's attending today. Lots of researchers in the audience. Okay, we have a pretty diverse group here. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to your questions and your input. So let's close out this window and move forward. I'd like to welcome Dr. Brian Gill of Mathematica Policy Research. He is one of our senior researchers here at the REL, and he has led several of our studies, and several of which will be coming up in the next several months. He is a leading expert on value-added metrics of school and teacher performance, of charter schools, school choice, and supplemental educational services. He has published in many different educational journals, including Economics of Education Review, Education Evaluation and Policy Analysis, Journal of Labor Economics, and so he is widely published and really is a tremendous resource for our REL. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Judy Ferguson, who joins us from New Jersey. She is a veteran district administrator. She was also former president of the New Jersey Association of School Administrators, so she is truly a veteran practitioner. And I think we've got an excellent group today, and not just presenters, but also with our participants. And so let me turn this over to Brian now.
Great. Thanks so much, Teresa. And thanks, Judy, for participating, and thanks to all of you for joining this webinar today. I confess that this is the first time I have done one quite like this, so but I will look forward to trying to keep up with your comments online as I go through my slides. And there'll be a couple of places where I'll pause specifically to try to invite input. You won't be able to do that over the phone, but you'll have the opportunity to type in any questions you might have, and so Judy and I will hope to engage you in some discussion. Let me see if I can advance the slides now. Yes. So as Teresa mentioned, this webinar is based on a report that was released a few weeks ago that involved a review of the literature on what we called alternative student growth measures that are being used for evaluating teacher performance and teacher effectiveness. And so what I'm going to try to do today is to describe some of the findings from that literature review. As I'm sure most, if not all of you know, states are now mandating that student achievement growth be included as a component of measures of teacher evaluation. This is coming partly as a result of policy changes at the federal level, where both the Race to the Top program and the waiver flexibility process for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act require states to include student achievement growth as one component, at least, in teacher evaluation measures. In the Mid-Atlantic region, all of the states have moved to adopt student growth measures, and in fact, the great majority of states all over the country are doing this. Now, most of the discussion around student growth measures has related to the quantitative measures that are typically applied to state standardized assessments in reading and math in grades 3 or 4 through 8. And usually the calculation of student growth and applying it to teachers involves something that is called either a value-added statistical method or a student growth percentile measure. And those things are complex and involve a lot of methodological discussion, but in one sense it's relatively straightforward to figure out what we want to do with them in those grades where you have tests, standardized state assessments in successive grades in the same subject. The challenge, of course, is that in most places the majority of teachers can't have a growth measure that is based on those kinds of measures because they're teaching grades or subjects that are outside of the state's standardized testing regimes. So again, as many of you probably know, states and districts are struggling with, well, how are we going to measure student achievement growth associated with all the rest of our teachers, whether they're kindergarten teachers or high school teachers or art teachers or special education teachers? And the point of our literature review was to try to find out what's known about how this can be done, about applying alternate growth measures to all those teachers who aren't in reading and math in grades 4 through 8. And we found that there are two broad approaches that are being used. The first one is to use the same kind of sophisticated statistical methods, value-added models or student growth percentiles, and apply those to alternative student outcomes. That is, apply those to assessments that go beyond what states typically have in reading and math in grades 3 or 4 through 8. So that involves the same kind of statistical adjustments, but using them for different tests and different kinds of student outcomes, and I'll talk a good bit about that. And the second broad approach is a more qualitative one, and that involves using teacher-developed or teacher-selected student learning objectives, which in some states, New Jersey, for example, are called student growth objectives, so SLOs or SGOs. And in those instances, there's not necessarily a need for a standardized assessment or a common standardized assessment, because instead the teachers have some discretion to develop or select an assessment. So what I'll be talking about is both of those general categories and what the literature has told us about the measures being used and what we can learn from them. To start, then, let's talk about the statistical models, the value-added measures and similar measures that are being applied to other assessments. First of all, we found in some places that value-added models have been applied to commercially available assessments, to tests like the Stanford 9 and other widely available commercial assessments. And the literature finds some encouraging evidence of both validity and reliability in using those commercially available assessments for getting value-added measures of teacher performance. By validity, we mean that there's evidence that they're measuring what we want them to measure. And in this particular instance, the research shows that value-added measures based on commercially available assessments tend to correlate positively with measures based on observations of teachers' professional practice and with measures based on student surveys, which is encouraging. It suggests that these are measuring something about teachers' contributions to student achievement that educators should care about. And then by reliability, there we're interested in the stability of the measures, in the year-to-year consistency, and the extent to which they're telling us something that is really about the teacher rather than just a random variation. Here again, the evidence is encouraging. The value-added measures that use the commercially available assessment, they show year-to-year consistency for individual teachers that is consistent to what we see with value-added models applied to annual state assessments. So that's good news. Now, it's also the case, though, that the evidence suggests it's a good idea when trying to use value-added measures in teacher evaluation, that it's a good idea to try to increase the reliability by averaging across multiple years of teaching and by making what the statisticians call shrinkage adjustments. And doing both of those things can reduce the amount of random error that the growth measures produce. That's true actually regardless of whether the value-added models are being applied to a commercially available assessment or to a state assessment. Either way, those are good practices to help improve reliability. What else do we know about value-added models? Well, the Pittsburgh Public Schools have been doing something interesting the past few years with some help from some folks at Mathematica. Pittsburgh developed, several years ago, started developing assessments that are aligned with individual courses across subjects, particularly in secondary grades, 6 through 12. These were not designed initially for purposes of teacher evaluation. They were designed to try to improve the consistency of the curriculum across the district and to produce standardized course-specific measures of student learning. But it turns out, as we were able to show in doing some analysis, that it is possible to apply the value-added statistical adjustments to these locally developed curriculum-based assessments, just as it is for commercially available assessments and for state-standardized assessments. But the curriculum-based assessments cover a whole lot more grades and subjects than the state assessments do. So it makes it possible in Pittsburgh to measure value-added for teachers in most middle and high school courses. So not just reading and math in grades 4 through 8, but in math, English language arts, science, and social studies in nearly every course in grades 6 through 12. And in this case, as in the case of the commercially available assessments, we find some encouraging evidence of both the validity of the value-added measures and the reliability. Teachers who do well in terms of value-added on the state assessments also tend to do well in terms of value-added on these curriculum-based assessments, which is encouraging from a validity perspective. And then in terms of reliability, we find that teachers at both ends of the spectrum, in terms of the measured value added on these curriculum-based assessments, are statistically distinguishable from average. So there's real information there about the teacher's contribution to student achievement. Finally, there's even some indication, very little information on this, but there's some indication that value-added statistical models could be applied not only to commercial assessments and to locally developed course-specific assessments, but even perhaps to some non-test outcomes. There's been some preliminary research done also in the Pittsburgh Public Schools on school-wide value-added for student outcomes like attendance and course completion. So here, not assessments at all. There's no clear evidence of the validity of those results, unfortunately. There is some evidence of their reliability in that it's possible to statistically distinguish the highest and lowest performing schools from average. Now, there is an open question about whether these kinds of outcomes would be suitable for teacher evaluation. In Pittsburgh, they've been used only for school level results because the notion is that these are the kinds of outcomes that are the responsibility of the school as a whole rather than for individual teachers. So that summarizes what we found with respect to the statistical models, to the application of value-added measures to other kinds of outcomes beyond the state assessments. And let me pause there because I want to give Judy a chance to comment, and I'd like to give all the rest of you the opportunity to type in any questions or comments you might have specifically related to the value-added models and their application to these other measures. And then we'll turn to talking about student learning objectives and student growth objectives.
Brian, I am, as a secondary school teacher originally, I'm encouraged by the Pittsburgh work in terms of designing end-of-course tests that can be administered across either grade level or curriculum and have some clear connection to teacher performance. I think that's a great direction in which to go. I have huge concerns, as you've already mentioned, with the measures such as attendance and course completion and how they relate or don't relate to teacher performance. The question is, does achievement improve because you've completed the course, or did you stay in the course because you were achieving, or did you drop out of the course for other reasons? And you really have to isolate the impact of the teacher on the effects rather than just a simple correlation, which is problematic. What's the cause and what's the effect there? But as a school-wide measure, I think it's great to look at things like attendance and in particular, and a lot of teachers and a lot of administrators, staff members have an impact on attendance. One teacher in a classroom really cannot impact on attendance, so therefore shouldn't be measured on that variable. I think perhaps at the college level, where attendance and course completion are specific to an individual teacher, because as a college student, I can go to class or not go to class, and I can complete the course or not complete the course. There may be more hope for it as an indicator of performance there. So those are my reactions at this point. I think if those kinds of measures are useful school-wide. They could even be used on a group of teachers, a group of staff members for merit pay if you can, as a school-wide effort, improve achievement through improving attendance and through improving course completion.
Thanks, Judy. I think that makes a whole lot of sense, and I think those are exactly the reasons that, that in Pittsburgh, for these kinds of measures, they are looking at them at the school-wide level rather than for individual teachers. We thought it was worth including them in the literature review anyway, because I think, partly because some of the analysis that's related to teacher evaluation is also potentially relevant to principal evaluation, which is something that districts and states are considering alongside this, and some of these measures might be appropriate for principals even if not for teachers. and more generally to let people recognize that that it might be possible the purpose of the value-added statistical method is to try to identify an educator's contribution to student outcomes. And the general point here is that we're seeing good reasons to believe that those statistical methods could be useful for a variety of different kinds of outcomes, and it's not just the standardized assessments in reading and math in grades 4 through 8. So in Pittsburgh and a few other places, they've demonstrated that it's possible to go beyond that it's possible to come up with value-added measures of teacher performance that make it possible to include a lot more teachers, and that involve using student outcomes that are specifically designed to be well aligned with the curriculum in the case of these curriculum-based assessments. And I see that there's a question here. There's several questions here. Let's see if I can go to some of the ones that are showing up on the screen here. One is, were the studies reviewed primarily for elementary grades? No. With respect to the commercial assessments, they were often in elementary grades, going up to middle grades. But for the course-specific assessments, they were secondary grades, 6 up through 12. So, and that's useful because, as you know, very few states have standardized assessments for most courses at the high school level. But there are clearly opportunities to develop those and to apply the statistical models to them. Another question about whether they're being used to evaluate special education teachers. And that is an area that requires a lot more research. To my knowledge, it's relatively rare that they are being used for that purpose. The problem is that you have to have assessments that will do a decent job of measuring the achievement and the changes in the achievement for whatever population of kids that are being served. There are almost certainly some kinds of special education students who could be included in these in measures related to the value added of teachers, but it's going to depend a lot on what kind of assessments are available for them and whether there are a large number of teachers serving similar kinds of students. So far, I would have to say that there's really very little known about the extent to which value-added models can be validly applied to special education teachers. I would expect that there will be a good bit more research on that in coming years, but I wish I could provide more information now. What states are considering using attendance in value-added models? That's a good question, and I don't know enough about the policy regime for that. I don't know of any state that is considering using it for teacher evaluation purposes. Whether there are some states that may be using it at the school level, I don't know. As I mentioned, it's certainly the case in Pittsburgh that they're interested in using attendance and other kinds of non-test outcomes for purposes of measuring a school's performance, though not for teachers' performance. Let's see. Oh, these things are scrolling upward rather than downward. We've got some answers as well as some questions. So someone's pointing out that in New Jersey there are regulations saying that students are only included if they attend for 70% of the year. Different states have different regulations about that sort of thing. And you can see these answers, I think, as well, so I'll let you read those. But we've got at least one more question here. How do you recommend communicating the uncertainty in these value-added estimates? That is a great question, and it's a real challenge. It's a real communications challenge. I think that one key point to make with regard to uncertainty is that any measure of anything has some uncertainty in it. So if you think about value-added models in the context of teacher evaluation generally, they're always going to be only part of a teacher's evaluation, and a large part of it is going to remain and should remain based on observations of professional practice. Now, in fact, a principal's observation of a classroom, or more broadly, a principal's year-long evaluation of a teacher's professional practice, has some uncertainty in it as well. But that's not always recognized because it typically isn't usually quantified. And so there's a sense in which the uncertainty or the reliability of a value-added measure is not conceptually any different from the uncertainty around the classroom observation, where what the principal sees depends on what day of the week it is, depends on how the kids were doing that day, on the particular lesson chosen. So the first thing I think is to make sure that there's a recognition that any measure has some uncertainty in it, and the aim is to try to reduce that uncertainty in any way possible. And so that's why I think that that's why when we are talking with districts and states about value-added models, we recommend that they average across multiple years of teaching to reduce the uncertainty, and we recommend that they apply this statistical shrinkage adjustment to reduce the uncertainty. And there's pretty good evidence that suggests that when you do those sorts of things in your value-added models, that you can reduce the level of uncertainty to a level that is as good as what you would get in almost any measure of job performance that is used in trying to understand someone's job performance outside of teaching. So I think that describing the broader context is a key point, and also explaining what the method is doing to try to reduce the uncertainty. Okay, I think that deals with all of the questions that came up here, and so this was great. So thank you for those. Let me turn then to the student learning objectives, the second broad category here. So student learning objectives, or student growth objectives as they're called in New Jersey in some places, have the great advantage that they can be used as growth measures for any teacher, pretty much, any grade, any subject. The way they usually work is that individual teachers choose class-wide growth targets that are supposed to be based on students' abilities at the beginning of the school year. In most places, they have to be approved by the school principal. And there's some variation across different states and districts in exactly how much the teacher has discretion to select the outcome measure. In some places, districts place constraints and say you need to use this measure, but you can choose what the target's going to be for this measure. In other places, it's more wide open and allows teachers to select with discretion. There is not much known about the reliability and validity of student learning objectives. We couldn't find any studies that have looked at reliability, looked at how much error there is, how much random error there is in the student learning objectives. So not nearly as much is known about that as there is for the value-added models. There's a little bit of evidence of validity. A couple of studies have found small positive correlations between a teacher's success in achieving the SLO goal and the teacher's value added. That's encouraging, but it's frankly there's not much evidence out there yet. And when you think about it, it's not too surprising that there's less evidence on the reliability and validity of SLOs than on value-added models, because the flip side of the fact that they can be applied to any teacher of any grade and subject, and that they, allow this customization, is that it's challenging to ensure their reliability and validity. When teachers have a lot of discretion about selecting the SLOs and designing them, then it's going to be hard to make sure that they are that they are comparable across teachers in terms of the difficulty of achieving the objectives. Moreover, they sometimes have to rely on teacher-developed assessments, and most often there's no information available about the reliability and validity of those underlying assessments in measuring the student's learning. So there's an enormous amount that's kind of inherently unknowable in a process that involves this much variation and teacher-level discretion. They do present some implementation challenges. Implementing student learning objectives or student growth objectives across a district requires quite a bit of training, not only of teachers who will be responsible each year for developing the SLOs, but also for principals who will be responsible for approving them and playing some role in trying to make sure that they are comparable for different teachers across different grades and subjects and classrooms in their schools. They involve a substantial amount of work for both teachers and principals. Apart from the training, even once the educators have been trained, they've got to actually do this at the beginning of every school year for each class of students. Some districts try to improve the reliability and validity of the SLOs by having a sort of district-level auditing that looks over them and provides a second layer of approval beyond what the principal provides. That seems sensible as a way to try to promote reliability and validity. I don't think there's no evidence out there on whether it succeeds in doing that or not, but it seems sensible. But of course, it creates an additional level of burden at the central office besides the burden at the classroom and school levels. In some places that have been using SLOs, teachers have raised questions about their fairness. Again, not surprisingly, given that it's hard to make sure that these things are consistent across classrooms. And then a final implementation issue that's a potential challenge is that using SLOs or SGOs for purposes of evaluating teachers, using them for what is in essence a high-stakes purpose, might undermine their value for purposes of instructional planning. And I think most of the folks, at least early on, who have been champions of SLOs and SGOs have promoted them, at least in part, and maybe primarily, because they view them as valuable tools for teachers in planning their instruction over the course of the year, that it can be extremely helpful to spend time analyzing your students' needs and abilities and setting targets for their achievement growth over the course of the year. When when those are also going to be used as a high-stakes evaluation for the teacher, that creates a little bit of a conflict of interest. That is that for purposes of instructional planning, teachers are probably going to want to, set very ambitious goals and targets. But if their evaluation then is going to depend on whether they meet those goals and targets, that implicitly at least might create some pressure to lower the expectations a bit. So that is something that I think districts and states need to think about as they put this together. So that's what we learned in the literature review on student learning objectives and student growth objectives. So I will pause again here before turning back to a general summary of the findings, just to ask what questions you all have, what comments Judy has about student learning objectives and student growth objectives.
Well, I'll start, Brian.
Thank you.
I think you've really identified the value and the concerns about using student growth objectives for measuring teacher performance. Let me start with the positive, the opportunities. Certainly, it's another opportunity for professional development, for teachers to learn and grow individually and collectively, to learn how to measure their instruction, to work toward instructional improvement. So we see things like professional learning communities, better conversations between principals and teachers about classroom instruction, more reflection, more self-assessment, and all of that. So those are all the good things about it. The concern with the reliability and validity as you get further and further and further away from standardized measures to classroom-made tests, and then using that to evaluate teachers for retention or promotion. Those are where the big problems exist. So, like you, I agree that the value for designing and measuring growth measures like this for teachers is that they can improve their instruction. The danger is that it's almost like a pseudoscience. We've created this elaborate statistical methodology around something that we know, it really is judgment. And we're back to the principal evaluating the teacher based on a lot of professional judgment, and teachers evaluating students based on their professional judgment. So we have to be very careful that we don't see this as all scientific and proven, and therefore we can make really important decisions a teacher's livelihood based on something this unreliable at this point and statistically, not valid or reliable, as I said. I'm going to beat a dead horse on that one. But, it is a tool. It is one of many tools, and I think it's a great tool, but we don't want to misuse it in education. And the other question I have, and then I'll turn it back to others to ask questions, is what return on investment are we getting here? We're putting a lot of time and energy and money into another way to measure student achievement. We have lots of ways to measure student achievement already. So, that's the kind of devil's advocate here to start the conversation. Is it really worth the time, money, and effort, considering what we're getting from it at this point in terms of knowing more about students have learned, how they've grown, and how teachers have impacted on that learning? So I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Judy. Those are really great and provocative thoughts. I appreciate that. Nobody has done a study of sort of a cost-benefit kind of study of student learning objectives, or for that matter, of value-added models. But I think it's an entirely appropriate question to ask, particularly because the level of individualization of these things necessarily implies that there's a whole lot of work that goes into them, and And there's a risk, as you say, of making something look like it's telling you more than it is by enshrining it in policy, even when in practice we know that there are serious limitations on the validity and reliability of an assessment or a target developed by any individual teacher who, frankly, is not in a position to be able to assess the validity and reliability of his or her own decisions there. Let me take a look at some of the questions that are coming up here. One person asked, where can we find resources for creating SLOs, best practices? One place I know of that has done a ton of work on this, and that's probably worth checking out, is an organization called the Community Training and Assistance Center, CTAC. And they've done a lot of work on implementation of SLOs and professional development, and also some of the research on SLOs. You can find them at ctacusa.com, or if you just go to Google and look up student learning objectives and CTAC, which again is Community Training and Assistance Center, you'll find some resources on their website. I'm sure that there are more out there. That's the one I'm most familiar with. Oh wow, somebody actually brought up the link. Thank you so much for that. I don't even know where that came from, but I'm impressed. Instant result. Yeah, so whoever's interested in that question, the link is now listed up there at the bottom of poll 3. Okay, what other questions here came up? Given the issues with SLOs, SGOs, what other ways can student growth be measured for non-tested subjects and grades? That's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer for it. I think the key issue here is to think about what one's primary purpose is, and if your primary purpose in trying to measure achievement growth is to use this for purposes of teacher evaluation, for a relatively high stakes measure of a teacher's contribution to student achievement, then I think that implies that reliability and validity are very important. So in that case, I think it's necessary, if we want to ensure comparability, it's necessary to try to think about, well, how can we make sure that at least in terms of consistency across a school and a district within a particular subject and grade, say, can we develop some assessments? That is, do something like they've done in Pittsburgh. Now, some states are adding assessments, particularly at the secondary level, that are course specific, and if those become more prevalent in secondary grades and subjects, there will be more opportunities to apply the value-added models there. But frankly, we're a long way, I think, from having any sort of standardized assessments that can usefully measure learning growth in, say, art or music. And so there really isn't, as far as I know, any great solution to that at the moment. I would say that that's one of the reasons that that having really good measures of professional practice is absolutely critical. I mean, I would say it remains critical even in grades and subjects where we have good value-added measures and good standardized assessments, but it's absolutely essential in grades and subjects where that can't be done. I wish I could. I wish I had more of a better answer to that. Okay. the real value in using VAMs or SLOs is what it tells the teacher in terms of how to improve instruction, what research has been done in this area. That is an interesting question, and I think that that's one where a lot of research is just getting started. One of the things that I always say to districts and states, particularly when they're considering value-added models, is that by themselves, value-added estimates don't actually provide any information about how to improve instruction. Even if they provide a really good, a valid and reliable measure of a teacher's contribution to student achievement, they don't by themselves they don't provide any support or any information about how a teacher can improve value-added. And there again, I think that the research needs to improve a lot in terms of connecting high value added to particular teacher practices. And frankly, as researchers, we're just getting started on that. But I think that even in the absence of a lot of rigorous research on that, I think that it should be possible for school districts and schools to look themselves at value-added results or student learning objectives results, for that matter, in the context of information about professional practice. And even if they're not in a position to do that in a sort of rigorous quantitative kind of way, I think that there's enough knowledge of professional practice among educators that it ought to be possible to use that knowledge to help in coaching teachers to improve their instructional practice if their value-added or student learning objective results don't look great. Let's see. How should performance measure data be collected from teachers? I confess I'm not quite sure I understand what that means. I guess it depends on what sort of performance measure it is, because it strikes me that all of the things we've been talking about are different kinds of performance measures. So, and that how it would be collected would depend on the type of measure. What weight do SLOs typically have in evaluations? That is very often determined by state and district policy, and it varies in different places, and some states give a lot of local discretion to school districts to determine how much weight that's going to be. Other states don't. A fairly typical practice is to say the SLOs will have in non-tested grades and subjects whatever weight that value added is supposed to have in tested grades and subjects, but that's not by any means universal, and there are some places where SLOs and value added are even used for the same teachers, that having a value added estimate for a teacher doesn't mean the teacher doesn't also get an SLO, and so it's some combination of things where the weight of the SLO might depend on whether the teacher also has a value-added measure. So I don't think I should say anything more definitive about that, because in fact it does vary depending on what state and district you're in. Are you seeing more SLO tasks that are performance-based or pencil and paper test? I haven't seen any studies that have specifically made that comparison. Certainly, both kinds of tasks exist, and my assumption is that which is used more commonly would depend a whole lot on what grade and subject we're talking about, but I'm not aware of anybody who's systematically cataloged those things to see which are being used more commonly. And so I think that goes to all the questions I see up there. All right. Well, thank you again for those. More good questions. Let me just go back to a summary briefly, and then we can talk more about any remaining issues that folks are interested in. So, brief summary that as we heard, there is good evidence that value-added statistical models can be successfully applied to alternate student assessments, including commercially available assessments and homegrown assessments, if those are consistent across the grade and subject within a district at least. The SLOs are broadly applicable to all teachers and sometimes correlate with value added, which is encouraging from a validity perspective, but they involve some pretty substantial implementation challenges and some threats to validity and reliability. So I guess here we're interested in learning from you what sort of alternative measures that you are seeing being used in the schools and districts where you work, and hoping that might inspire a little bit of discussion. And that is apparently poll 4. There it is. So yeah, so let us know what kinds of alternative measures are you seeing being used for alternative growth measures for purposes of teacher evaluation. My sense is that nearly every state is now using SLOs or SGOs in some form or another because again, their student growth measures are being mandated for use in teacher evaluation, and nobody has standardized assessments for every grade and subject. But I'd be interested in hearing about any variance on those practices, or anybody who is seeing standardized assessments other than the conventional state tests being used and having value-added statistical models applied to them. Okay, here we're seeing if you have teachers using portfolios designed with students where the rubric is standardized. Okay, well that's a very interesting one, and seems like a promising way to go to try to create some standardization where, while still having it be applicable to all sorts of grades and subjects. Maybe we can do some research on that in the future. District-developed assessments, nationally recognized assessments, industry-certified exams, student projects and portfolios, students meeting or exceeding expected growth on the pre- and post-Northwest evaluation assessments. So that's an interesting one. That is kind of a hybrid. So it's using a standardized assessment from the NWEA, which I know many schools and districts across the country are using for diagnostic purposes. One opportunity I would suggest looking at there is actually formally applying a value-added statistical model to NWEA assessments rather than just counting the number of students meeting or exceeding expected growth, because just counting the number of students meeting or exceeding expected growth might not fully account for student differences. However, I also recognize that there are many districts that don't have the resources or the size to get value-added models systematically applied, in which case meeting or exceeding expected growth might be a good alternative solution. Instructionally sensitive summative learning targets, district assessment. I'd be curious to know what that means. Sounds interesting. Document-based questions with department-created rubric. Yeah, again, I'm not sure what that is. An Arizona elementary district is using NWEAs with student growth percentiles. Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, that seems like a promising direction in which to go also. So good. It's clear that, everybody is struggling with this and trying to figure out good ways to do it. Oh, here's another question. If you're using an RTI, which I'm guessing here means response to intervention framework, and doing universal screening several times per year, might that be a good way to measure student growth school-wide or for individual teachers? That's a good question. I don't know enough about the RTI framework to know whether that's the case. It strikes me as entirely possible that would work. Universal screening is certainly something you'd like to see in order to promote validity and reliability. So, so there might be opportunities to apply value-added statistical models to the screening results from that framework. Okay. Teachers selecting Common Core state standards that have been identified as essential to success in the course in high school math, using a lot of pre- and post-assessment that addresses this Common Core state standards. So that, again, is sort of a hybrid. So the idea is to rely on the common standard, but presumably, and the pre- and post-assessment. I guess the question there would be, how do you ensure consistency of setting standards for different classrooms and different kinds of students? Okay, well, this has been very helpful. Thanks for your input here. I think we are almost done. We have one more poll for you, asking what action steps you plan to take. That is, are there, if you were working in a school or a district or a state, have you learned anything here that might suggest directions to go as you develop growth measures for teacher evaluation? Judy, can I ask you, what would you advise a district or state about action steps?
Go slow?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Policy is moving very fast at the moment.
I think the dearth of research is a big concern, and if states will take some time before the high stakes part kicks in to really evaluate the effectiveness of student growth objectives for measuring teacher performance and get more data, get more information. That would be a wise thing to do. Probably not going to happen, but it would be a wise thing to look for. We need more research, and it's clear in the work that you've done, which is phenomenal. It's just not a whole bunch out there, and we need to invest a lot more time and effort in finding out what is reliable and valid in terms of measuring teacher effectiveness.
Well, that's a message I always like to hear. I'm glad you said it rather than me.
And you didn't tell me to say it either. I think it's while people are writing their responses there. And one thing I've walked away today from this webinar and from the reading and preparation for it is I do think there's a lot of incentive in this process for teachers to learn how to make better assessments, and that's the thing. So, yep. But it's the high stakes part that is so concerning at this very early stage of our knowledge base of what works and what doesn't. So that's my take.
Great, thank you. And then we're having a variety of action steps proposed here, hoping that the new assessments from the consortium and the data connected by New Jersey SMART will provide more support to the process. Yes, there are lots of states are trying to improve their data systems. There are new assessments, as you know, that are going to be coming along online that are supposed to be aligned to the Common Core and to individual state standards. And I think there's reason for hope that that those will first of all provide better information about what students are learning, but then ultimately permit better information about what teachers are contributing to that learning as well. Yeah, I hope that you find some of the resources we've provided to be useful. I think we have a link somewhere to our report. If you look at the resources, the little resources box, you can download the report there, as well as finding it on the REL Mid-Atlantic website. Those of you who are interested in learning more about SLOs, I'd recommend checking out that CTAC website. And good luck to you. I have to confess that it's easier to be in a researcher position here than it is to be on the front lines and trying to make these things work while you're teaching and running your schools. So I think that's our last poll, and the only remaining thing is just any final questions that any of you might have that we haven't already addressed. Are there any further questions remaining? And if not, then I will turn it back over to Teresa to talk a little bit about where some of this information is going and what's going to be happening soon in other events and presentations from REL Mid-Atlantic.
Great.
So
thank you
all very much.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you very much to Judy. We did not lack for questions, so I'm very pleased with the level of engagement that we saw from our audience. And so with this slide, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email Brian, and there's his email address, bgill@mathematica-mpr.com. And if you have any questions about the REL, its work, and any of its efforts, I'm more than happy to answer and share with you any information that you might need. My email address is teresa.duncan@icfi.com. I also invite you to continue the discussion on our forums on our website. You'll see the link up there. I think particularly with some of the follow-up steps, and since this is an ongoing effort really for everybody, we'd love to hear from you and to continue the discussion and learn more from each other's efforts. So please do join us on this online discussion forum. What we're also going to do is collect all of the responses, some of which we had several questions come in prior to the webinar among our registrants, and so we didn't get to answer all of those, but we will compile those as well as those that came in during the webinar and put them in a FAQ kind of document, and we'll post that on the forums, and so you folks are able to download them and engage in discussion as you wish. So we hope that you'll find that a useful resource, and we hope to see you there. I also wanted to put in a plug for several of our upcoming events. Before the holidays start and everybody runs away for the holidays, we have 4 events in November, 2 of which are from our Teacher Effectiveness webinar series. And so we have one coming up November 7 focusing on pathways into teaching, and then another one on November 21 about the teacher's role in quality classroom interactions. We also have a couple of other webinars. One focuses on, this is a practice guide published from by the Department of Education, and it's focusing on improving mathematical problem solving in grades 4 through 8. And so that is taking place November 6th. And we have a different type of webinar on November 18. It's very hands-on. It's intended to be a tool that might be of use to district and district staff, administrators, and that is using and creating automated data dashboards. And that is for PC users, so I'm sorry, Macintosh, we're working on it. Macintosh users, we are working on it, but we're not there quite yet. And we are continuing these types of webinars in 2014, so please join our mailing list. You can do that from our website, and we hope that you'll find REL Mid-Atlantic to be a resource that you go to often. And so I invite you to take a minute to complete our participant satisfaction feedback survey. Your feedback is very important to us, and so we do listen and we do respond, so please do fill out that survey. It should take you no more than 5 minutes. And so Sharon, I think if you could send them over to there. I'm assuming that the link is going for everybody. So thank you very much for participating.